Good morning, everybody, and good evening to those who may be joining us from Asia. And welcome to this next webinar in the series of the Armstrong Wolf Conduct and Culture Summit, entitled Purpose Over Profit. We are in day 3, where we are covering governance and a number of technology solutions. This is day 3, where day 1 we looked at leadership and we've looked at purpose on that day as well. And day 2 we were looking at the emerging risk profiles, which included a number of unexpected elements such as the behavioral risk and the, if you like, the environmental risk that we're facing thanks to COVID and also to changes in expectations from society in terms of the environment. Today we are talking about a moment basically when crisis called and the COO answered. And we have today a panel of extraordinary experience with us. We have Andre Cronier, who is a former global COO, Sapna Dattani, former COO and MD of DWS Asset Management, Ian Heaps, who is Executive Director, UK COO and Deputy UK CEO of BNP Paribas Asset Management, and Eric Rabin, COO of Societe Generale. So a broad spectrum of expertise to take us through this and to talk about whether or not the pandemic will be one of the greater influences in shaping governance, strategy and innovation after the pandemic. So what I will do is I will ask just each of our participants to give us just a brief perspective, and then on this, just a small statement, and then we will start the discussion, the panel discussion after that. We're expecting there to be about an hour and 15 minutes of this discussion, and we'll certainly try to leave 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. And one thing I didn't mention is that my name is Patrick Butler. I am the managing partner of Armstrong Wolf Institute. I have a background in the diplomatic service, but also in banking as an M&A banker, as an operating officer during a period of great transformation at HSBC, as well as a compliance officer during transformation at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, building out with the after effects of the crisis. And in the last 8 years or so, I've been working with banks to help them bring a fundamental aspect of culture, conduct, behavior to their operating models to enhance performance. I've also run the UK Finance Conduct and Culture Academy, where we help banks to do that on a broader perspective. So since January, I've joined Morris, who is still trying to join us. Unfortunately, he's being technologically challenged, but I'm hoping will join the conversation as well. Morris Evelyn Bufton, who all of you, I'm sure, know and know well. So perhaps in no particular order, I could just take those who are that I can see on the screen today, and maybe start with you, Sapna. If you would give us a little bit of your perspective, how you see the pandemic, and particularly from your experience, what you see are going to be the challenges and the potential opportunities from a governance and risk and innovation perspective.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. And good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. So I think there's a few things that come to mind with respect to the COO role in the crisis situation. We've been through, quite a few over the last 15 years. Firstly, I think that in a crisis situation, most people tend to bed down into their specific roles and experiences, and that's where their value comes through. So whether it's specific risk management issue or working with particular clients. And I think in crisis, the difference with the COO is the COO's ability to be flexible, the breadth of experience is really key to help the organization move forward. And I think that the recent pandemic is definitely an example of that. When we think about the work that people have been doing has been essentially the same. They have been extremely busy, but it's the way in which they have done that work has changed completely and utterly forever. And the COO's role in providing a central structure around that, thinking about the home office situations, the return to work, all of that has been really, really key. I think the second area around how the COO's role is changing kind of post-pandemic and around governance is, I guess you mentioned on the conduct side. And pre-crisis, there was less of a focus on conduct. Post the financial crisis, a huge amount of focus on controls, conduct. And a lot of it was working with the regulators. It was around specific setups. It was things we should do and things we shouldn't do. But it was less from a true cultural standpoint. So I think that we did try and figure out, what is the right sort of culture we should have within our institution. But I don't think we probably went far enough. And I think going forward, if you think about the role that, first of all, financial services plays in society, it's very critical. And then the role that the COO plays within an organization to really be a culture setter and a tone setter from the top, along with the CEO in most cases. And then you think about the shift in general society around movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter. All of these things now play into what is believed to be good culture and good conduct. It isn't just whether you have done the KYC properly and you're working with your clients and you don't have insider trading issues. It's more than that. It's people's overall behavior that is becoming much more under scrutiny. And I think if you think about some of the high profile cases of people being taken to court around behavior, I think the next step for the COO is to really take this cultural shift in society and try and embed that into organizations, and for financial services to try and play a really important role in moving society forward on that. Patrick, you're on mute.
Yes, one question maybe for you and for the others to think about as we get to them. So you talk about that role of the COO to try to embed that behavior. And we look at the normal levers that a COO has in terms of governance and controls and technology and so on. How do you think the COO can sort of uplift that approach? Because the relationship with the CEO is going to be key in terms of what the strategy is, where the priorities are in doing that. And how do you then embed that, if you like, in that governance structure so that you have the right metrics, you have the right measurements, you have the right levers to pull, if you like, from an HR resourcing perspective as well as a controls perspective. We've had a number of discussions about controls versus culture and the extent of investment in controls versus the investment in culture. But also, particularly yesterday with Tracy McDermott, we were starting to talk about how we actually influence that behavior, and that we still have a long way to go in terms of measuring behavior in a way that allows us to reward it in a coherent sort of manner. So where do you think the COO might be able to sort of drive that agenda, if you like, post-pandemic?
So I think it's a great question, and I don't think we've fully figured out what's the best way to do it, but I think that is indeed a huge part of the COO's role. And I think given that the COO now plays such a big role, not just in terms of running the organization, but also thinking about it from a communication standpoint, an HR standpoint, it's really important to look at the levers. And I think, a lot of this, it's the softer skills that the COO brings. It's a lot about the EQ that they have of the organization. And I think that tone from the top is really, really important. And I think ultimately people sort of react more when they know that behavior that is not allowed is actually actioned upon. So I think that, we've definitely seen, in our industry that people who have committed, foul play around whether it is insider trading or risk management issues, you have seen them, then be punished. But on other aspects, and I think this comes back to one of the discussions that you had on Monday around character traits, are we really looking at organizations top down and saying, do we have the right sort of characters to take this organization forward? And I think there are always people in organizations where people say, well, that person's great at their job, but they're terrible to work with. And they're actually, you wouldn't want to, don't go for a drink with them after work, and things like that. And I think that the COO and the COO's organization plays a really important role in understanding what's going on around the organization. Where are those discussions coming from? And I think it may come to a point, yes, identifying individuals who perhaps don't display the character traits and trying to see, what can we work with them? Can we understand where that's coming from? And can we think of ways of embedding those sorts of issues and discussions into performance measurement and management? It is hard, and it's hard for people to speak up, but I think that, I guess what we've learned over the last year, aside from the pandemic, is that people want to speak up, they want to be heard, and topics that people didn't want to raise in the past are now being, forefront and center. So I think it is a good time to now review these governance and processes and procedures, as you say, but I think we're doing it in a completely different context than we did 18 months ago.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, that really brings, if you like, all the various aspects together. And I'm going to pick up on one thing, but later. I'm going to go through some of the other panelists first. And just to give fair warning to everybody, that question of character that comes through, some of the conversations have been, we look for the character in individuals. And I'm just going to put the little challenge there that the character that is within people quite often is unseen. It's the manifestation, which is the behavior that we see. And that manifestation is often made through intrinsic decisions and intrinsic motivation within. So how do we determine whether the actual behaviors that we see in an individual, they're terrible to work for? Is that a function of the environment and what their expectations are, what they've been led to believe is sort of behavior that is expected, and how we can manage the culture to change, if you like, the manifestation of those traits. So that's something I'm just going to leave on the side. But first, perhaps Eric, your views, please. I mean, if you would give us your perspective on the whole governance and technology, and where the COO can make a difference.
Okay, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. As said by Patrick, I'm the CEO for StockJet, but only for Asia Pacific, not for the whole Société Générale. Reflecting on the crisis, the pandemic, and the consequences. First thing, obviously, during the pandemic, the CEO took center stage in many organizations. If I took my personal experience, on top of my role, I'm also the crisis director for all the regions. Obviously, yes, center stage, I know a few things about that. And it was about managing the crisis, but also working the crisis management, also the ways of working, the work from home, the tools, the real estate. If we put ourselves forward, do we need as much building offices in the coming years? One thing also, I think, where the CEO, as part of this role, was also involved, it's the management of individual situation. I don't know, it's like it can depend from country to country, but if I look at Asia, where many people are born in different countries, our families, I'm based in Hong Kong, but many people here have families in Korea, in Australia, in Japan, in France, in London or elsewhere. Many individual situations to manage, and the CEO were also involved in that part, which is more an HR, I would say, topic. So really CEO at the center stage. Now, if we fast forward and we say, okay, tomorrow, hopefully, we'll be out of this pandemic thanks to the vaccine. What will stay and what will go back to the previous life, I would say. One thing, perhaps, in some case, the CEO will a bit leave the center stage because other priorities will come back to each organization on the business side, on the compliance, on the risk, on the clients, and so on. But one thing, perhaps for me, if the CEO during this crisis has really demonstrated some leadership, and the CEO had a lot of opportunities to demonstrate this leadership during the crisis, that will stay. Meaning the CEO or the other partner, the other manager, team leaders in the department, in the company, in the banks, wherever you work, all the other partners, stakeholders will remember that the leadership that the CEO has demonstrated during the crisis, and most likely they will refer perhaps more often than before to the CEO, either on some projects, some topics, some art topic, I would say, or also, especially if you have been, the CEO has been able to manage some, I said, individual situation, also on other aspect, more perhaps on the culture, on the conduct, having the CEO as a referent, leader, a wise man or wise woman, I would say. If you have been able to demonstrate that during the crisis, people will perhaps rely more often than before on the CEO on some topics which are really on the CEO perimeter, remit, but also on other area due to this leadership, this wise man or woman role.
Eric, that's natural, I suppose. What we see is the way that people behave in that. That's the natural dynamic you'll see. There'll be greater respect for the COO, as you say, which stands to reason. And I'm wondering, this is again a question for all to think about: is there something that the COO can do to act, if you like, to cement that role that they have played through the crisis? And I'm thinking, going back to some of the webinars we've seen about analytics, for example, about measurement, about creating a link between behavior, conduct, culture, and value through purpose, like financial value and therefore performance outside crisis, that they could perhaps use those governance and technology levers to build a framework that allows you to say, well, look, this is what happened. This was the behavior we saw. This is what, when we were dealing with the crisis, we saw people coming out, which was good. How do we embed that in the organization? How do we then measure it and make it part of the actual day-to-day work and operations of the business outside crisis, so that we get the most of it, that we benefit from that? And through doing that, the COO starts to retain, if you like, a more central role and a more impactful role within the organization. Do you think there's scope for that?
Yeah. I think I'm not sure to follow you on all your assumption. I think that a few things. First of all, before the crisis, we're already in a significant, a big transformation around the digital transformation. You know the stuff about the data and so on. I think that the crisis has perhaps reinforced, accelerate that transformation. And very often, the CEO is very often overseeing, managing, or liaising, or being in charge of technology. So as part of that, the role of the CEO can only reinforce that. On the change, the way people have worked during the crisis, perhaps differently, the behavior, and so on. There is two things. There is one thing which is more around the practical ways of working, work from home, the collaboration, and so on. So I think that here again, that can only continue after the crisis, because people more often work from home, for instance, and they will also the CEO will provide the technical environment for that. We take part of that. And if I look more at the ways of working more from a culture standpoint, it was first the engagement. So I think that's how can we continue to build on that, knowing that after 1 year, 1.5 years of lockdown or semi-lockdown or social distancing measure and so on, we have lost also the level of engagement have also changed during the crisis. I think that we all have, and whether the CEO or other team, a significant role to play in rebuilding some kind of momentum. When you think that in some cases, for instance, in Singapore, in my company, I think that for 1 year, the team were split and they didn't see each other for more than 1 year between January or February, early February or late February, late January last year and March this year. 1 year where some teammates were not able to meet really at the office or at the restaurant and so on. So we have also to rebuild that. So I think we have seen some positive engagement, everyone fighting to deliver for the companies and so on. After 1 year of this situation, there is also some fatigue. And now we have to also to rebuild on that. So at the time being, I think one of the things, it's really how do we overcome that fatigue, I would say, and bring everyone back together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And this is something which I think we've seen in quite a lot of the conversations with the COO community over the previous months, and we continue to have those discussions about maintaining productivity, if you like, going into the future, depending on whatever structure we have post-pandemic, if you like. Ian, if I could turn to you, from your point of view, how do you see the sort of the governance and the technical potential of the COO changing post-pandemic in order to have perhaps a greater influence after this crisis?
Well, thanks, Patrick, and good morning and good evening to everyone. If I start by saying, when I first thought about this question, how has the pandemic changed the role of the CEO or seen it evolve? Originally, I didn't think there was actually a significant evolution, but when I began to think about it, my opinion changed. So I think there has been significant changes. If I look at it, for me, that the pandemic plays to what is a natural strength of a COO, and that natural strength is essentially that we know how the business operates, actually, in reality, how it operates. So how order raised in Hong Kong gets settled in the US, whether how the IT system that's based in Brussels or Australia, how they combine to make it work. Having that knowledge across this complex chain that we have brought the COO, I think, to the fore in a pandemic situation. So I think, one, it raised the profile of COOs. And I think, if I speak personally, I feel as if I developed somewhat by having a greater involvement in the communication that we were giving to our staff. I think rightly becoming much more involved in that, something that may perhaps historically have been something led by HR. That became more involvement. So that was an area for me where I believe I developed, and I would like to think that I have a better feel for all of the people across the entire company in all of the different circumstances that they experienced the pandemic. So how will that enable things going forward? Well, one, I would say this, wouldn't I? But yeah, I rather hope that the enhanced prominence of the COO within each organization, that is maintained going forward. It's given the COOs the ability to demonstrate that they can look across the entirety of the organization and speak knowledgeably across all facets. So I would hope to continue to use that. If I look at conduct and governance, my view on this, and I hope this doesn't come across in any way as complacent, I've thought, certainly for my industry, so asset management, I think there's long been, and it's perhaps rooted in the fiduciary responsibilities, which are core to asset management. That's always been the case. But I think the increased focus by regulators on conduct, that was very much building on strong foundations already. I happen to think the SMCR regulation we have in the UK, I think that's a very effective piece of regulation by making individuals accountable, making them responsibility, making it very difficult for people to consider that the organization might somehow take the hit if wrongdoing has been done, and instead the focus that this is individuals. So I personally believe within asset management, at least there is a very deep-rooted good conduct culture. And from my vantage point of having a UK-focused role, but within a global organization, my sense is that the UK might be the furthest along in developing that good conduct culture that the regulators are so keen to see. So combining the COO's ability, their enhanced visibility and reach across the organization, their natural strength of having that innate understanding of how things work in practice, and able to build on somewhat, looking at my own position again, looking from the UK, where I, perhaps not entirely objectively, but I consider that the UK is at the leading point of that curve in developing a strong conduct culture, then I would think that's then the platform for COOs to continue to embed it, and to see that broaden across locations.
Thank you, Ian. And that's it's interesting when you bring in the regulatory approach in terms of governance, and if you like, the conduct themes that come from the regulator. One of the things we have seen in the last, and we had Ted McDonald from the FCA on one of the sessions yesterday, and it's somebody that we speak to quite regularly from Armstrong Wolf. He's in many ways at the leading edge of where the regulator is thinking in the UK. Now, I think the UK does like to think that it's at the forefront of the conduct and culture argument from a regulatory perspective. I know some people who might think that the Netherlands is further ahead, but certainly these two jurisdictions have been talking about behavior and culture and bringing that into the whole regime for quite a long time. And it may be something that is not normally within considered to be in the remit of the COO in terms of culture. But we have it on very good authority that certainly the FCA is focusing very much on the COO as a carrier or a vector to drive culture within the bank, because of exactly what you've described, is that connectivity. And I think that the way that Ted McDonald described it yesterday is having tentacles in everything. So you can feel what's going on, you can see what's going on, and you can also sort of drive what's going on, you can influence it. And perhaps that rise to prominence is something that where the COO can have that independent perspective, look at all the framework, all the things which basically impact decision-making behavior at every level, and start to tweak those particular things, whether they're metrics, whether they're controls, whether they're management techniques or education and so on, in terms of line management and leadership skills. That they can start to drive. And that would fit within the culture and the senior management regime remit as well.
Absolutely, and let me relay some of my own experience. So we're a very global organization, and what we've done very intentionally in the UK is to develop a strong culture of, BNP Paribas UK within the family of BNP Paribas globally, but a strong UK culture. And that means that where there are at times not entirely overlapping processes or objectives or even cultures, we have a strong UK culture which is rooted here. And it means that with many of the control functions, whether that's risk control, legal, reporting up to the COO as they do in the UK. So they have their global line, but they also have a UK line. Speaking personally, that gives me the opportunity to engender that UK culture, which is very clear around conduct, and it gives a reference point for each of those functions. So the COO has got a very broad coverage. So it has the touch point, has the tentacles, to use that phrase, across the business. And by developing that very sound, this entity, our entity, a clear identity for PAM UK, what we think we've been able to do is really develop that UK culture and encourage, and in fact make it explicit within job descriptions that everyone, particularly at the senior level in the UK, they're not solely there to bring a risk perspective, a compliance perspective, a legal perspective, or whatever the function may be, that every senior member of our ExCo is a steward of our company. They all have a personal stake and responsibility and accountability for it. So we minimize any sense of people considering, well, that's not a legal problem, so if it goes wrong, that's not on me. We make it a very collective effort. We've engendered that sense of, this is our business. The success or otherwise of this business reflects on each and all of us, and that's been very, very effective.
Okay, great. I mean, I'd love to come back to some very specific examples. If you could maybe, if you've got them, perhaps if I turn to Andre before we do that. But it would be very interesting, and certainly for the audience, to see specific examples of how that works. Not just putting in the job specs, but perhaps how you, if you like, foster the right behavior. How you make it clear that these are examples of the sort of behavior we're looking for, and how you might link that to the success of the business. So in terms of the values of the organization that fit the purpose of the organization, remember, we're here to talk about purpose over profit, or whether purpose should be over profit, or whether it's purpose with profit. But how some examples of where you've seen, if you like, an unexpectedly good change in the way that a part of the organization has moved because of that approach that you've taken. I mean, that would be very helpful. If you've got them off the top of your head, that's great. But I'll give you a chance to think about that perhaps, and then turn to Andre for his perspective. Andre.
Thanks, Patrick. Hello to everybody. So just commenting specifically on the mandate of the COO and the scope of the role, and how it sort of changed through the pandemic, and whether there's scope for the role to change now post the pandemic. I think the important thing to point out is that the relationship between the CEO and the COO is quite critical. And what I mean by that is that the priorities of the COO is to a large extent set by the strategic imperatives of the CEO and of the organization. So obviously, through the pandemic that we've just lived through, a lot of the focus has been around sustainability, making sure that the business is robust and it can operate in a very difficult environment and people can work from home. But clearly, in an environment where people now are possibly going to start moving back into offices, the whole dynamic changes and the priorities changes. And in that context, the COO's responsibilities will change. Now, whether there's scope for the role to expand or not is to a large extent driven by that relationship and understanding of the role that the COO can play with the organization at large, but most specifically, I think, with the CEO. Because to a large extent, any aspect of what COOs typically do, cost, the change agenda, the transformation agenda, the controls agenda, conduct, behavior as well, is to a large extent driven by the imperatives that were set out possibly at the beginning of a year. So in that context, I think it is probably not appropriate to talk about an expansion of the mandate in isolation of understanding that it's actually part of a bigger organization, and that the strategy and the priorities is sort of set as part of a bigger plan. That's the most important thing that I want to say. Clearly, in terms of what might happen or what the shift might possibly be going forward, obviously a lot of focus, as I said, has been around resilience. Prior to the lockdown, a lot of the focus was around optimization and cost efficiency. You would hope going back now, that there will be much more of a focus around the growth agenda. Now, you mentioned that there is a potential expansion of the mandate in terms of being more involved on the HR side, on the development side, and for that matter, on maybe bringing the communication brief in. For me, in a way, it's almost not part of an expansion of the mandate in isolation. I think a COO is pretty much at the heart of what goes on, sort of the glue in the organization. So to the extent that it is necessary, and it's always necessary to communicate and possibly to over-communicate, I don't think you can look at it in isolation to say that you've got a communications function made responsible for communication. I just have never found that as particularly effective. It is possibly better to try and organize through the part of the organization that is most impactful and probably has the best access to the organization at large. So I think the fundamental point I want to make is that I don't think you can look at the mandate in isolation and say, has it expanded? Is this now a permanent change in the scope of the mandate? I think it will change again, but to a large extent, this mandate is a living mandate because it's part of the organizational makeup and it's driven by the strategy of the time.
So you talk about, you said, these elements are already part of the COO mandate. Are you talking then about perhaps a reweighting, if you like, or focus by the COOs or an up, if you like, so increasing, if you like, how they actually deliver that part of their mandate, whether it's communications or HR, in terms of lessons learned from the crisis?
The big lesson to be learned from the crisis, and we've had prior to the crisis, we had lots of the sustainability sort of tests that we did, essentially to try and prepare ourselves for some sort of an unknown crisis. Nobody thought it's going to be a global pandemic, to be honest, but that was sort of what we tried to prepare ourselves for. So in that context, I think we can tick the box to say that the sort of the training that we've done in advance of this pandemic to a certain extent prepared ourselves probably fairly well to be able to have a sustainable business through a very difficult time. So in that context, the sustainability, severance, all of the conversations that were somewhat theoretical before the pandemic will now become absolutely live. A lot of focus shifted before the pandemic to, and I'm obviously from an investment banking environment, a lot of the focus was around the effectiveness of the business, the cost control within the business, the technology, the mandate that essentially has to be delivered against the backdrop of a business that is suffering reduced margins and reduced profitability. I don't think that piece per se is necessarily going to change. I don't think the dynamics are going to change that dramatically. It's probably been a better year last year, but it was somewhat opportunistic as opposed to a sustainable trend going forward. So the sort of the efficiency, the optimization, the cost mandate that is very much part of the COO's brief, I don't see that necessarily changing going forward. Conduct culture has become part of the brief, and it has been part of the brief probably 2 to 3 years ago, because it was almost centered around the delivery of a program, which is inappropriate to look at it that way, but that is how it sort of got delivered into the organization. But conduct as a theme and culture as a theme and how it underpins the organization is essentially what COOs is about. That is what they will do. They are culture carriers. They have to be seen to be doing the right thing. And the most important thing, COOs have the ability to influence a very big proportion of the organization because it's pretty much at the heart of what goes on. So in that context, as culture carriers, as people setting examples of what's going on, I think the COO is in a unique position to do that. But I don't see that necessarily as an expansion of a brief. I think that is part of what the organization is all about now. And it has pretty much been very specifically part of the mandate, at least for the last 3 to 4 years. So that hasn't necessarily changed.
Okay. Can I pick up on something that you said there? And this maybe will start getting us into, let's dig down into the weeds a little bit in terms of the examples that I mentioned earlier. You said the conduct and culture as a program, the way that it was rolled out, it sounded like you didn't really agree with that method, the way that was done. I mean, do you think that it actually had the right impact in the end, or is there a better way to do it? So, I mean, are there examples of how how you think it could be done to embed the right sort of mindset within the organization, or better mindset, or more purpose-oriented one?
Conduct and culture is not a program. And to roll a program out and to tick every single box, to then pat yourself on the back to say that you've had a fantastic, you've delivered a fantastic program, and as a result, the conduct and the behaviors and the culture of the organization is no longer a concern. That is just not on. It will definitely not work. I can say that with all positivity. However, the issue is, if you talk about conduct and culture, it is quite subjective. And I think the hardest thing in terms of what good culture is and what good conduct is to try and set a benchmark out there of what does this look like? What do you measure people against? I mean, we're talking about global businesses. And what is acceptable behavior in one part of the world may not be acceptable behavior in a different part of the world, not because more things are being condoned. Culturally, people are different. So in that context, there's always a subjective element to when you get to culture and conduct. So in that context, it can never be a program. However, and this was the hardest thing when we sort of got into conduct and culture. I think if you ask two people in the organization what good conduct and culture and behavior looks like, they wouldn't be able to give an answer. And I think today still, it's hard to articulate exactly what good conduct and behavior looks like. I think there's a certain way that we look at things. And I do think in that context, it has to be measurable. It has to be driven by some sort of a metric system that at least you can point to something and say, we are at least meeting these type of standards and we are trying to measure it objectively. So some aspects you will be able to do objectively, and those has to be measured. But there's also an emotive, subjective aspect to it, which I think is harder. And I think that they sort of go hand in hand. And that's what I mean. I don't think you can deliver a program, but it has to be done on some basis to deliver certain basic things, which is maybe the more objective aspects of it, to try and get the program to a sort of a level that you can say, okay, we've done the minimum possibly. Now it's the subjective, softer things that we need to work on, which is all around behavior, tone from the top, and the sort of the examples probably being set by senior people. And in that context, the COO and the CEO organization, I think, is critical.
Yeah, thank you. And perhaps that is the key thing. It's that measurement, is what we measure, how we measure it, and then how we actually report it across. And that's where maybe we get into the nitty-gritty of this. That, as you said, when you speak to two different people, I was, to be frank, I was concerned when you said that somebody wouldn't be able to even answer the question of conduct and culture. If two people give a different answer, then that at least is a step forward in a way. I
honestly hope that I'm too negative about it, but I am not 100% convinced that even today that people will be able to give you a very good definition of what good conduct looks like, even after everything that we've done, for the simple reason that it is such a subjective thing, and what is acceptable to one person is not necessarily acceptable to another, and that is what makes this very, very difficult.
I'd like to invite anybody to come in on that particular area, particularly if we're, again, looking at where the crisis, perhaps lessons we learned from the crisis, the sort of behavior, conduct that became crystallized in a way that we could perhaps recognize it, see it again, and find a way to foster the sort of behaviors that we want to see, or those that we don't. Maybe there are some examples that came out of it, which will then help post-crisis to drive the agenda, to drive better productivity and a much more constructive and successful organization. I know, Sapna, you've been nodding, furiously through many of that. Have you got any particular ideas in mind that we could share?
So I was completely agreeing with Andre that there's been so much work done from a program perspective, but how has it really changed people's understanding and true behaviors, and is what they go to work and sort of do from a tick box exercise different from how they believe they should behave in general? I wish I had the answer, but I guess I'll give you an example of perhaps, again, the way that companies think about their training and development has perhaps shifted a little bit over the past 5 to 6 years. And I think, again, as I said earlier, this sort of bigger shift in society makes it a better time now to try and embed some of those these programs. So I think a lot of the leadership training that we used to do at sort of mid to senior levels, there was a lot of celebrating diversity. So there was a lot of, okay, let's bring all the women together and sort of discuss certain things, or let's bring all of the risk division together. And I think that quite often there was, and I know it's hard now with the pandemic and people not being able to travel, but I think there was a little bit more of a shift. Instead of celebrating diversity, trying to move towards this inclusivity with respect to thinking about culture and conduct. So let's bring together people from different disciplines across the bank and from different cultures and areas, and put this question about what is acceptable behavior into particular, whether it's role plays, situations, see how people are reacting to different things, and allow them to talk about what works, what doesn't, why might I be unhappy about the way you've dealt with this situation, where just creating a conversation that is much broader. And I think that, 10 years ago, you would only get the sort of the front office bankers together, perhaps, to talk about a situation like this, if you did get them to talk about conduct. So I think it is really important to sort of, yes, celebrate diversity, but move towards being inclusive in thinking about these topics, especially given that our industry is so broad and so diverse, and so across so many countries and cultures. So I think we do have a societal responsibility as well to make sure that our people understand what good behavior is. And as you said earlier, it's not just down to the specifics of the content that you do at work, it's the way that you approach yourself. And again, Andre talked about the relationship between the CEO and the COO, and that sets a lot around the tone for the company. Some of the best teams that I've worked with, you've had a really good dynamic between those two people. And I know that was the subject of discussion in one of your sessions yesterday as well. But it's, again, the COO is really, really important in setting that tone from the top. I think given the crisis as well, perhaps less for financial services, but certainly for other industries, I think people within a company, investors, etc., are really expecting the CEO to focus now on what is our strategy? How do we navigate the crisis? What's our business proposition? How do we survive this fundamental change in the way that people are working or doing things? And I think the COO is almost expected to, really focus on, okay, what does that mean for us internally? And so to have a COO that is complementary and diverse from your CEO is really important, especially now, I think. But I as I said, I completely agree with Andre that it has been a program, it has been a tick box exercise for many people. Yes, it's obviously resulted in a lot of improvements, but I think what's happened with if you look at Archegos, the example of capital management, again, you have risk systems in place. People know what I presume there were kind of systems that would be flagging certain issues, but people have taken the decision to ignore them or to not listen to the broader cues and be, again, focused more on profit rather than should we be doing this business or not. And again, it's the COO's, it's the whole organization responsibility, but how do we make sure that people are really thinking twice about decisions that they are making more broadly and thinking about the broader impact of them? And the COO can't solve that by themselves, but if they're in a good central position and independent position to kind of force people to start worrying about that. So I think there's still a lot of work to do, but as I said, I think a lot of the groundwork has been done over the past 5 to 7 years post-crisis from a content perspective, and now we're at a good point to move that even more into behavior.
you were veering quite beautifully and naturally into purpose when you talk about the societal need to see that what the way that we're working, and diversity with a small d, not a capital D, I think is key. That question of cognitive diversity, bringing different parts of the organization together so that they talk more effectively. And the role of the COO sounded like almost, because of those tentacles, that central position, that you could actually bang heads together. The Archegos, as you say, but also Greensill, frankly. I mean, let's not forget that, and the fact that the risk function was somewhat undermined in one particular bank, and they have been drastically impacted by it.
Yeah.
So again, this again touches. Sometimes, if you look at the COO and the role they can take, that rather than constantly talking about reducing risk or reducing costs, that they can actually be a revenue driver and a profit driver in the long term. So the profit you mentioned, people were looking at profit, it was short-term profit, not thinking about weighting it against the massive risk in the long term that it actually could apply. And if you weight them together and you do the calculation, you're going to end up with a worse situation than if you actually brought people together, spent a bit more time, and actually had a bit of head cracking going on. So thank you. But particularly at that point, we're touching on that purpose of what we're here as an organization to do, as a bank, as an industry. Eric, Morris, are you with us? Are you with us, Morris?
I am with us, but I am with you. I think Ian wants to come in on a point. Actually, can you? Am I live?
And I will say a word after what was said by Andre before. Okay, go ahead, Ian.
Welcome back, Morris. Just checking. Very quick point on touching on something that Sapna said. Culture kind of conduct goes both ways. So one of the changes from the pandemic is, I think many of our, let's say this industry has probably been rather guilty of presenteeism. And that, when we're focused on diversity, that affects different people different ways. So the staff, we've seen it through the pandemic, it's been a very different circumstance working from home for the person who joined 3 weeks earlier and has no ability to get to feel the business, for the 24-year-old who might be sharing a flat with 3 other 24-year-olds. How on earth do they all work together? Very different from someone like myself who's got enough grey hair to have a spare room where I can work from. So it works both ways, and one of the changes of the pandemic is it's going to change the way companies treat or consider presenteeism. I think that largely goes because we're all going to work in some blended fashion between working from home and working from the office, and that ought to have, very hard to measure, but I think important effects for our diverse workforce and the diverse circumstances that they have. So it goes both ways. That's an area where we can't solely look at us as the company having very strong expectations of the culture we expect from our staff. This is an opportunity for firms to show a good conduct towards our staff by evolving, developing, and in a way which I think has important, albeit quite difficult to quantify, impacts around the diversity of our workforce.
No, thank you. I think that's true. There have been we've had I've been involved in an ex-industry, a non-financial industry work group on the pandemic aspects, the outcome of it, and there have been some very surprising results as to what a number of industries outside finance, so both engineering and oil and gas, retail, and so on. Some of the lessons that they've learned from the pandemic, and exactly the sort of things you've described in terms of people's dynamic of working and the extent to which some people have been excluded, for example, who were previously included as part of the organization, and then also new people coming in and trying to find a way to become part of the organization, to understand the culture and be within it. Much of it has basically fallen on the shoulders of line managers. And in many ways, middle management and risk functions have found themselves distant. So that if you like, the middle to upper levels have found that they haven't had much to do because senior managers have jumped in and had a much closer relationship with those on the front line who've been doing things. And it's something which Morris has mentioned a number of times. We've seen that come out, even to the extent, and I think one of the previous webinars when somebody said, is there a role for middle management in the future? Because they haven't really been seen or needed during the pandemic. And that may be a challenge for the COO. So yeah, how we treat people, how we manage them is clearly going to be a bit of a challenge. And it's something we've been talking to COOs and some of them about what is going to be needed in the future in the new world, as it were. So, Eric, you wanted to come in on, I think, a point something Sapler said.
Yes, there was first to come back on one point mentioned by Andre a bit before, so I'm going back a bit about the what means conduct, what means culture for different individuals in the company. I think also the question it can be also different thing from a company to the other because it's based on the history of the company, based on the issues that company can add before, and also what the culture of its company. You know, the culture of HSBC, BNP Paribas Asset Management, or Société Générale are totally different. And so sometimes it can mean a bit different things, culture and conduct. So I'm not surprised that if we were to ask us and other people, what does it mean? We'll have different definition, different meaning, different goals. Then I would like to come back on the point of the pandemic, conduct, and so on. I think that unfortunately also the pandemic kind of also created some issue around that. What I mean, first of all, generally, it's easy to work online to produce, to do a production task when you are on Skype, on work from home, on Teams, on whatever the system you have, and so on. It's much difficult and it's easy. It's possible to teach new joiner, the junior, the young analysts or associates who have joined our companies in the last 12, 15 months. It's possible to teach them online how to do a confirmation for an FX deal, or to develop things, systems, and so on. I think, my personal view, it's much difficult to teach them a culture when you are online. No, culture is fine. Behavior, you can have some training about what you should do and what you shouldn't do with a client, with on the markets and things that are good or bad, and so on. You can try to teach that online or through a Zoom session or Team session. However, is it enough to develop the right culture for your new joiner, or your especially for the juniors? And you know that the first year when you join a company, when you leave university and you join the company, very formative year. You know, it's you learn a lot of things. You learn the technical point, but you learn a lot about the behavior, the culture, and so on. And when you have been doing this first year of as an analyst, more or less always online from your room, your place, your apartment, this is something which is difficult, and perhaps we'll realize in the coming months, in the coming years, that we have not a lost generation, I won't say that, but a generation of new joiners who have not been able to train them and to give them the right behavior, culture, and so on. Because this thing is not something that you can do fully online. That's my personal view. Another point also, it's more a question than for all of us and for the future. During this crisis, obviously the first objective, and it was said earlier, I think that's still by Andre, was the main objective of the CEO, the boss of the company, was first to survive, to be able to survive going through that work online, and then the resilience and so on. But it was more something, the basic needs of the company. After that, we we are started to do a bit more than that. But the first need was really to survive this crisis. We are out of this mode, but still there in the background. So will you see in the coming month here some people who have perhaps focused too much on the survival mode and forget a bit about also the behavioral, the conduct, and so on. So for me, that's a question. At least, will we see some bad habits or bad behavior coming back? Because in the past 5 years, it was we all had the messages on the focus, the program on culture, on conduct, on every banks, every financial institution, and so on. Last year, it was a bit different because the first objective was really the survival mode. What does it mean for the future? And obviously, the point on the what about the lost year for all our analysts who have joined us in the past 12 months on the culture.
Eric, thank you. That's very valid. And I'm going to bring Maurice in just a second on a related topic. But to that point, this is something that we're seeing right across the board. And certainly the Institute, as we're developing, is looking at trying to provide new thinking on that and guidance as how we can actually help that, both with culture, in an online environment, but also a mixed and blended approach to working, like split teams and so on. And these are things which we're starting to talk to some of the COOs about, how we can bring that in. So the culture point that you raise is critical. And this is something which has exercised me with the Conduct and Culture Academy for some time, how we do this. Now, what's interesting is when we get into the dynamics of how cultures change, you can go into a new organization as an experienced banker and your behavior will change because of the culture of that organization. So similarly, when people come out of being online and they come back into the workplace, their behaviors will start to adapt, because we as human beings are incredibly adaptable in that way. Depending on what they see, they will take example from those people around us. As you rightly said, they can't do that online because they can't see that. They just have these very transactionally focused relationships. And that's something we're going to follow up.
Patrick, I'm sorry, can I just, one comment you made around middle management, and it sort of links into what you've just said. I think the area that is going to be under the most scrutiny and possibly will require the most change in terms of how it's done and how it's evidenced is supervision. I mean, most of the things that has happened historically that hasn't really stepped up to the expectation of regulators, or for that matter of shareholders, was rooted in poor supervision. And I think the way that we're operating now makes it harder to evidence that there's good supervision. It also makes it harder and that links into the whole cultural aspect, to show the right type of behaviors and to evidence the right type of behaviors, that people do the right thing, which makes supervision less important. So you're getting into this sort of vicious circle that it's very difficult to see how people are being supervised. It's very difficult to evidence that they've been supervised. And as a result, you don't necessarily know where they are culturally.
You're right, Andre. And this is a conversation we had on Monday evening when we were talking about things like the senior management regime in terms of conduct versus control. Monitoring with a small m, i.e. monitoring to make sure people are well and are performing, versus surveillance in its traditional sort of much more hierarchical and regulatory sense. And on that, I want to bring Maurice in, particularly in terms of that decision-making SMR. And then we've had a couple of questions, which I'm also going to bring in, and I think we're going to get more as well. So, but this is, Maurice, absolutely perfect segue to what you were looking to say.
Thank you, Patrick, for holding the reins while I wasn't off on an extended coffee, by the way. I just had a failure in connectivity. And actually, it's been a real pleasure to actually listen into the conversation, particularly when I look at those on the panel that have actually been advocates and supporters of my endeavours and efforts over the many years. There's 3 points I wanted to bring in. One is about the middle management. Secondly is around training, and the third is around decision making. And they're all parcel actually the possibly becoming more visible or identified because of the pandemic. And then I want to pivot that into, so what does this mean for the COO post-pandemic? I think the first one, the point that made the individual that about not having, it wasn't so much not having middle management or the role of middle management, but I think if you visualize most organizations now as a person, they look like most organizations that spent too much time at the cake stand, and let's say they're too fat around the middle. And that's and the problem is that there's a number of reasons for that. One is that the seniority of the individuals, that we've had a shrinking market in relation to headcount, and you've actually had individuals at the more senior levels, which are actually have still got a reasonable amount of time to run within their careers. So you've got this bottleneck of talent, which has been caught in this middle management layer. But I think that I also agree with Andre's point is actually, but they are also the bridge for supervision as well. Yeah, they are the ears and eyes of the executive and the bridge between, military parlance, between the field marshal in the tent and actually the troops in the trench. So the second point I want to come on is in relation to training. Eric talked about onboarding individuals, and actually the challenge of, you could actually argue but it's a blessing for some individuals, Eric. They haven't been taught bad practices by certain individuals as opposed to good practices. But I think that you're right that they haven't had that mentoring. They haven't had that, which has very much been the US banks feel. If you think about what the CEOs of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs is, that's one of the preeminent or primary reasons they want to get back into the office, which is to nurture and develop directly their young talent. But I think what's happened in the pandemic is that the importance of training has actually come far much more deep-rooted and anchored to the role of the COO. It used to be, yes, a necessity, and there was some tick boxing, and it was done in partnership with HR out here. But now as we move towards the decision-making process of where are we going to take my business post-pandemic? And we got the bookends of Goldman Sachs saying, it's an aberration, come back to the work, no change. And you've got the other bookend, which is Standard Chartered Bank saying, we're going to give as much optionality and variability for staff as we can do. And all the industry, buy and sell side, is going to probably find its position in some form of hybrid location, hybrid model. But what that will require is training and targeted training in relation to performance productivity, which produces profitability. And the COOs that we're speaking to are saying they're because of that aspect, that they are far more deep-rooted in the design and the potential output and understanding the application and development of training for their staff than they've historically been, which is no bad thing as a carry forward. And I think that's some of the stuff that Patrick's been doing, and we've spoken on many times this week in relation to, we've looked at how do you marry some of the lessons of the military that works in a distributed, dislocated workforce, and they have a mission command structure which leads to empowerment. And at the bottom end of empowerment is that they train every single leader at every single level in relation to decision making, which actually brings me to the third point. Satna, you talked about the case study in relation to actually it was poor decision making that led to that particular issue with that asset management. There's a well-known Swiss bank that's been in the news recently in relation to, it's got itself into some troubled waters. When I speak to certain individuals there, they said actually it wasn't a failure. It wasn't a failure in controls. It wasn't a failure in policy making. It was a failure in decision making and judgment that actually has led to this. The issue that they're now dealing with. And I think what we've seen, because of the distributed workforce, where you've by default had to empower decision making to people working in isolation. What you haven't trained people on is the decision making process. And then wrapped in that decision making process, you should actually have the integrity of that decision making process. And the simple adage of, if there's any doubt, there's no doubt, should lead to actually shape what your decision is at the end, because you understand consequence. And I think that that is a component part that hasn't really been focused on in relation to, and that's part of culture. Because if what you want to do is that you want to train people to make an informed decision and take them through the decision-making process, invariably to make decisions under pressure, and that pressure can be in relation to time frame or the necessity of profitability, but you need to train people at the decision-making process and frame it in that in relation to the integrity of that decision making. And the problem that we have is from the executives, say in the UK and the variants in the US, the Series 24 and various other siblings of the senior managers regime, that the executive, they've had their decision-making process to a degree regulated. They're conscious of any decision they make actually ties to their individual accountability, and therefore they're conscious of that decision-making process. But people further down, they're not regulated. So what they have to do is try and control and monitor their decisions, but not actually train them in those decision-making processes. And I think this is one of the key things that we're looking at is, and that could be a component part of culture, and that could be leadership by example. You know, although my decision-making process is regulated, and I don't want to be sitting on a beach 7 years after retirement, someone knocking on my shoulder said, "Can you remember that decision-making process that you made 7 years ago?" Well, actually, we want you to come back to us. We need to investigate that. So this regulation, the senior managers regulation on one side is the simple codification of good business practice anyway, therefore we shouldn't worry about it. But it does actually have a conscious impact on the decision-making process of senior managers. But what that doesn't do, as I said, it isn't regulated in relation to people further down. So I think one of the things that we have seen shift is the importance of targeted training and the responsibility of the COO to actually shape that training to help define productivity, enhance performance, which leads productivity to profitability. But the second such thing we want is you train them on the integrity of that decision making. You train them on the consciousness of, if there's any doubt, there's no doubt. And that's guys, I'm almost done. I've almost run out of air, Patrick. Then the other thing is that if you're in doubt, that's when you escalate it. You escalate it to your supervisor, you escalate it to your manager. This is what my decision, and if you have any doubt, then they should actually be able to give a third-party view, which is the collective judgment on a decision, on its impact and consequence. That's just my opening gambit for having not been able to join in the conversation.
Can I connect that back to and ask the participants back to, if you like, the theme of today, which is about governance. And link it to a question. So training. In many conversations that I've had with control organizations, compliance functions, and when we look at conduct frameworks, when we ask about controls, people talk about training as a control, but also training as a tool to drive conduct and culture. It is a messaging process because you are saying what the standards are. To what extent do you think that this is actually a relevant and important part of your governance structure as a COO? Because that takes it back to the role of the COO. And I think that is a relevant question. It links to what Morris has said, and a question from Chitvan Chanhol, who came in and said, the whole question of managing the conduct of an individual business remotely is a challenge. But what areas are you looking at as individuals from a governance perspective? And he says, I'm interested in he has more interest in good conduct examples as opposed to bad ones. And so Morris has talked about training in good decision-making, better decision-making. Perhaps there is a connection there that any of you might have examples that you could bring to this and respond to Morris's point.
Patrick, I'm just not sure what you are referring to when you connect good decision-making with governance and good supervision with governance.
Well, it's more about training with governance. What would you regard as a governance tool? Would you think training is a governance tool?
It's part of a mandate, but it's not a governance tool. Why would it be a governance tool?
So how would you define governance then?
I think governance you have to define in a very narrow sense. It's not supervision, it's not control. Governance is the structure that you put in place to ensure that you understand what's going on and that there's proper controls over the organization.
Right.
Training is maybe an aspect of it, but it is not governance. Governance is very narrow. That's my perspective. So
would training be a control? Would you consider training to be a control within that governance framework?
No, it's an enabler.
Okay. Good. Okay, it's an enabler. Good. Interesting. Okay. But back to Morris's point, perhaps about that whole question of the role of the middle management, training and onboarding, and that decision-making process. Would anybody like to sort of respond to that? Maybe look at these examples that we touched on earlier, that good examples of where this has worked, or where they found that there has been an improvement, or something they've tried to put in place.
Patrick, if I can come in on that briefly, and I would echo Andrew's view that training is an enabler, a development tool rather than a control. You could look at it and say it mitigates risk if people are trained to do things well. There's a reduced propensity for operational error. If I look at training and decision making, I think I feel there's a need for better training on decision making, because something I see now, and apologies, this is focusing on a negative. Something I see that for me, there's something gone slightly awry in how we treat risk within decision making. I have a sense that some people, perhaps some functions, have formed the view that if the risk, when it's been mitigated to its fullest extent possible, if that exceeds 0, and that could be 0.000, and then you get to a number, it can be infinitesimal, tremendously improbable, that if the risk is greater than 0, then it has to be flagged up, it has to be brought to the attention, and someone else must make that decision. And I feel as if somehow a message is being absorbed, whether that's via training or other approach, that we're in the risk-free business. We're, unless we invent a new branch of economics, we're not in a risk-free business. So I feel there's something there that we need better training, particularly around risk and how decisions are made on the basis that there will almost always be a residual inherent risk, and how do we approach that? And for me, the approach is not you keep going until you get risk to 0, because in many cases you will never get there. The point is we need to train people to own the residual risk
and to manage this. And I suspect that this comes from a number of conversations that we've had at the academy about people saying that our risk appetite is 0, which is just simply not feasible. As you say, banking is the business of risk management, but moving risk from those with a low risk appetite to those with a high risk appetite, however it works, it is about managing it, and that's what we do. So you can't have 0 risk. Would anybody else like to examples? Do you see the same thing? And have others seen that in their organizations, that there is this propensity, and perhaps examples of how you might be dealing with it or wish to deal with it?
One of the things I would come back on the question of the risk appetite. We are in a bank, so we are earning money because we are taking risk. The point is that when we are taking some counterparty risk, we expect some review in front of it. So we say, okay, we are ready to take some risk on some client. When we are taking some market risk, the same. We take some have some position. We are long dollar or short the euro, whatever. And we have some limits, so some risk appetite on that. But we are expecting some money, some review out of it. The question when we talk about conduct and culture, on conduct more specifically, not all the cases. In most cases, when we are taking some conduct risk, the review is less obvious. Obviously, it depends. Sometimes we are perhaps dealing with a client which is perhaps not the right type of client. So we are taking some conduct risk on KYC and so on, and then perhaps can expect some review. But in some case, we are taking some risk with no revenue, or at least no obvious review. And for me, the conduct risk or operational risk are a bit different. I'm not saying that it's we have to target 0, 0, 0 because it's just I agree it's impossible, but it's a bit different on some risk where at least we are and we can quantify the more counterparty risk we take, can quantify a kind of range of revenue we'll have. The more market risk we will take, we can quantify a range of revenue we'll expect at least. If we are talking about conduct risk, if we are taking some conduct risk, we don't know the revenue, and on the other side, the size of the risk can be if we are not caught, that's fine. But if there is an issue, the FCA or the ECB, the Fed, whoever comes, the cost could be very, very high. So here, this question of risk appetite, I understand. For me, the fact that we have a significantly lower or close to zero risk appetite on the culture on conduct risk, it's normal because it's not the same nature of risk as market risk or counterparty risk.
Very good. Yes, thank you. And maybe that will come into the whole question of purpose. What is the bank there for? Is it about revenue? Is it customers? Is it a mix of the two? And how do we get the balance from a purpose perspective? Sapna, I think you wanted to come in on this.
I completely agree with both of the previous speakers and what Ian said around people being very reticent to make decisions and being extremely risk averse just because of things that have happened. And I wonder if we sort of bring back one of the earlier points that COOs have been very involved in digital transformation and the use of data. And I think it kind of brings together the training piece. That if people understand the decision-making process, that they have the ability to lay out what are the risks in this scenario and situation that we are accepting as we go forward. And then the question is, how do we monitor whether those risks come to fruition? And I guess what we don't have right now is a lot of it's still very manual, whether it's, for example, credit committees or people in market risk doing monitoring. And I think as we move banks and financial services, we sort out all of the data. We're sitting on a huge amount of information that we should be using really to help do a lot of that risk monitoring and saying, okay, this is the risk, this is what could go wrong. And now do we have the system set up in a way to monitor changes, whether it's pricing markets, customer behavior? I mean, it could be anything now. The compute power is so high these days that if we can use the examples that we've had over the past many years and feed that into kind of the machine learning aspect and have all of the data there, perhaps that's a way in helping people, helping the banks to move forward and make people feel like, yeah, we're taking on a known risk here. These are the elements we need to monitor, and we're not just relying on people to monitor it. We have the broader infrastructures help as well.
Great, thank you, Sam. I think we seem to have lost Patrick.
Sorry. Yeah, no, thank you, Sam. And we've talked a lot about technology in the last couple of days and how that can help us in those respects as well. And it's interesting that you raise particular types of risk, like credit risk. The extent to which we can understand the behavioral risk that might come into the response to some of the decisions that we make. So we make decisions as to how customers might behave, how therefore in aggregate and therefore markets behave. We understand that behavior as well better. Then we can assess those risks better. And there are becoming tools which will allow us to do this, but also, maybe that's part of the training, is training people to understand behavior better. So in terms of behavioral models, concepts, things like behavioral economics, which is what the regulators started out looking at in 2013, and what impacts which is where the senior management regime is sort of based. It's based upon that. So yes, absolutely. Thank you. So Maurice, yes. I'm just conscious I'm just checking. We've got 5 minutes, just a 5-minute warning, everyone.
I want to give 1 minute to everyone in relation to, I'm going to keep it very short, in relation to the impact on the role of the COO pandemic and what do they think that this could do for the role moving forward. My summary is that, and it's come back a number of times over the last 2 days, the role of the COO has been far more visible and influential in the pandemic because of the nature of the crisis it's dealing with. And you could argue that is a key component part of being a COO. But I think what's happened is the platform of the COO is being far greater understood in relation to its centralized position, the tentacles going into the business, the fact that it has the voice of the CEO. The question, therefore, is actually, will this platform be used for a broader, better purpose moving forward or not? Ultimately, it's going to come down to the CEO and how they wish to use their COO. Ian's quite lucky actually having both hats. He's just got to talk to himself on that. But I think the ultimately comes down to the CEO. But my view is that in relation to, we've seen the shift in relation to the COO being far more involved in centralized communication to staff on matters which would have previously been more HR driven. We've seen the COO grappling more around human capital aspects and training and health and welfare. We've seen the COO, the relation to the controls and the culture and the conduct, it's all coming under the COO. And the fact is that there was a comprehensive failure of the imagination across industry and countries and government in relation to the lack of preparedness for the pandemic. We don't want to mistake and fudge the fact that the industry reacted pretty well to it with the factors that there was no preparation done for it. So I think there's also the space of the COO moving from a hindsight to a foresight to anticipatory footing, and how in that context of non-financial risk management could the COO play a better role partnering the chief risk officer. That's my summary of the possibilities, but whether or not they're coming into reality, I don't know yet. I hope so. Maybe if I'm looking at the screen, I'm going to start. Andre, what are your views?
Maurice, I've sort of given my views. I do think that it is defined to a certain extent by the relationship with the CEO and what that scope of the activity is. I have seen since the lockdown and since the pandemic that the roles and scope of the role has been redefined already by some organizations, and it hasn't been expanded. It's a narrowed focus, which is because that's what the organization needs at this point in time. So I don't think you can assume that it will automatically be an enhanced or an enlarged mandate. It was a requirement maybe at the time, but I can also see it going the other way. And it will purely be driven by the needs of the organization at the time.
Thank you. Ian?
I would hope that the enhanced visibility and perhaps the broadening, not necessarily in terms of functions, but in areas that the COOs played a role in the last year. I would hope somewhat selfishly that does continue, that increased prominence has allowed a value to come through, and that most CEOs, as Andrew said, it would come down to the CEO, that most would see the value in it and seek to utilize it. We shall see.
Thank you, Ian. Satma?
I'd agree with everything you said, Maurice, and I just go back to the fact that it's, as was said before, as people go back to work, go back to the office, we have this fundamental change in the way that people are operating, not necessarily in what they're doing. I think the COO is well placed as a central independent person or organization to really guide through that change. And as you say, forward thinking around culture, around the shifts that we've seen in society, and trying to bring that how we operate alongside the CEOs, what are we doing right now? So I think that sort of linkage to society and purpose, which is just becoming a much more important topic for people, is really going to be, should be sitting with the COO.
Thank you, Satma. Eric?
I think I will try to make the kind of synthesis between what Andre and Ian just said. To the point of Andre, I agree with him. The CEO took center stage during the crisis. Crisis is no longer there, so the CEO will leave the center stage, and then other people will to the center stage, depending on the priority of each organization. So that's there is nothing automatic. We say because the CEO was really the driving seat during the crisis, he will stay in the driving seat. No, I think it will depend on the organization, the priorities, and so on. That's for the point of Andre. The point of Ian, I would say at the same time, I think that if during what I said earlier, if during the crisis, the CEO with visibility, but also if he has demonstrated the right leadership, and it's not only a technical expertise or technical capabilities, but the right leadership, most likely the CEO will perhaps rely a bit more on the CEO, not because the role of the CEO, but because he would have said, okay, yes, that person, that woman, that man had really demonstrated some leadership, and I can trust him or her to lead other initiatives. So that's for me the true element of the answer to your point.
Garrett. Patrick, thank you very much for taking my reins. God bless you for that. I give you the closing comments then.
Thank you, Maurice. I mean, I would just like to say, I mean, this has been a fascinating journey, and I would just like to raise some of the so whats that come out of it. And some of the conversations that we've had have covered elements such as measurement. How do we actually measure the behavior so that we can understand it and influence it is one way, whether it's through training or through setting an example. And also the future role of the COO in being proactive in driving things like collaboration, cognitive diversity, as opposed to the capital D diversity, to ensure that there is always a balanced view going forward, so we don't get into trouble, but also that you drive innovation and productivity within the organization. This is an area that is critical for the COO. And one example of that is breaking down silos. And I would just give a little bit of an ad for some of the activities we have today when we talk about the 3 lines of defense, which is exactly this point about breaking down silos that we're going to be talking about. And within that concept, the COO perhaps has a role which started coming out, something that Sapna said that struck me, that they can actually help to drive and determine strategy with the CEO because they understand how the business is going to work and what will work, what won't, and therefore help to drive strategy, which, by the way, is the action plan to deliver purpose. So, we can see that there is not a greater role, but a richer way of performing the role in the COO going forward out of this pandemic.
So thank you, Patrick. Thank you all. We are going to be requesting from the COOs to ask their CEOs to participate in a 10-question, 35-second survey. We're hoping we might be able to grab their attention for that next month, which is going to be asking exactly this question about the CEO and the executive view of the role of the COO. Thank you all for your contributions. Sapna, thank you for joining today. Ian, thank you for your advocacy and support in helping Armstrong Wolf set and establish the asset management CEO community. Eric and Andre, in different ways, you've listened far too much to me for over the many years. God bless you for tolerating that. I will be sending you a pair of ear mufflers for future conversations. Thank you all, Patrick, and thank you, and speak later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.